Welcome to Bristol Legal. This is Elizabeth Nowakowski. I am the professor of paralegal studies at Bristol Community College. Welcome to our show where we bring you legal issues that are relevant to you and your communities. Today, I am very pleased to have back our guest, attorney Karina Valencia, who is a local attorney and also an instructor at Bristol Community College teaching family law. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We are going to talk today about a very sensitive topic, domestic violence. And would like to dive into that issue to bring awareness to our viewers. What is domestic violence? What they should know about it. So maybe we can start talking about what is domestic violence. If some, I'm sure there are some, I don't want to say biases, but some sort of perceptions that people have about the topic. But can you tell us what is actually domestic violence and how is defined?
Sure. Domestic violence is defined by a pattern of abusive behavior, which is meant to establish control and power over another individual. And those abusive behaviors, oftentimes, especially in the legal world, we think about violence as physical or sexual violence. But in the world of domestic violence, that can also mean emotional, psychological, or even financial abuse. And I think oftentimes those other issues don't automatically pop up into people's heads when we say, oh, domestic violence. It's also important to note that for the purposes of the law, domestic violence occurs between people who have either been intimate partners, are currently intimate partners, or are members of a family. So it can be parent to child, it can be parents of children who never actually lived together. But the nature of the relationship is what qualifies it as domestic violence rather than just a regular assault and battery on another person.
So domestic, in that sense, sort of is two-dimensional. One could be domestic because they are actually cohabiting.
Correct.
And the other part of the domestic, the other sort of aspect of it would be the actual relationship.
Right.
So they could be not living together, but they could still have that maybe some kind of
familial dynamic.
But
right.
They don't have to. So that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of if we could dive in a little more in terms of types of different kind of domestic violence that can exist. You mentioned, you already referred to the sort of the physical violence, which usually people think of, or sexual violence.
Right.
But there are more types of domestic violence.
Right. Probably the most common is psychological abuse, because the law can't control, nor should it, our ability to speak to each other with kindness and respect, right? So it's not against the law to be rude or disrespectful to your partner. It's probably not a sign of a healthy relationship, but for the purposes of the law, there's not much a police officer, or a district attorney, or a defense attorney can do about that, right? The law can't police all of our behaviors, right? And so that's why more often we think of sexual or physical violence. Also, I had mentioned financial abuse, right? Oftentimes, people either don't realize that when they're trying to leave or their inability to leave an unhealthy relationship, it can be tied into their economic freedom, their economic control. So economic abuse can take subtle or overt forms, right? The more overt form is one partner having total and sole control over any income that comes into the family, right? And it can start from the beginning of the relationship, or it can start maybe after you have children. One person stays home, and then the situation of daycare never resolves itself, so that person just doesn't have their own income, doesn't have access to bank accounts, financial information, credit information, which is really important. Or it can take almost like a punitive act, which can be really subtle. For example, person A says to their partner, I want a divorce. And for the past 5 years or so, the partner, person B, has been earning income somewhere between $70,000 and $80,000 a year because they work overtime, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now person A says, I want a divorce, and person B doesn't have as much overtime anymore, or maybe is claiming that hours are being scaled back, or money is missing where it used to be, maybe makes new large purchases, buys a car, uses person A's credit or personal information to obtain credit, creating an economic situation that oftentimes, especially for people with children, could either delay or deter you from leaving an unhealthy relationship.
No, that is, and there's also the property, right? Destruction of property and
Yes.
pets. That's another one I read about,
Yes.
where that's another sort of type of violence.
Yes, it's so all of these under the world of domestic violence
Yeah.
are considered violent,
Violent.
and maybe for the purposes of our discussion, we should call it abuse.
Abuse. That's a good
Right?
idea. Yes. Yes.
Because the violent acts towards property or person or animals, right? A lot of those could be covered. The property could a little bit more murky, how to cover marital property destruction during an argument, right? It may be something someone has an emotional attachment to, which loops back into that power and control dynamic, right? This is really about one person having all the power over another person, and trying to control their actions and behaviors, sometimes in overt ways, like destroying things that they have an emotional attachment to, harming their pets, which can be a little scary because you may think, well, it might be a substitute for me, right? But again, in these sort of more subtle ways that over time can erode a person's ability or erode a person's perception that they have a choice to leave this situation.
Now, you mentioned initially when I asked the question, let's talk about what domestic violence is. You mentioned the word pattern,
Yes.
which means probably that I assume it means that one incident of violence. Let's talk about violence. Battery or someone hitting someone is not. Even if it's in a domestic setting, does it rise to the level of domestic violence? And then maybe the follow-up question is, why do we call it domestic violence? What is the difference? What are the more protections, or how does the law treat domestic violence situations differently than a battery?
Okay.
Let's say. So it's a loaded question. I
It
know.
is a loaded. So, without delving too far into the history, so there used to not be a domestic violence specific law, right? Everything that was an assault and battery under the law was an assault and battery under the law. Over time, with much study and much research, it was determined that in situations where people have a familial or an intimate partner relationship, which includes abuse of this nature or violence of this nature, the potential consequences are much more grave than on stranger-to-stranger violence, right? A stranger-to-stranger violent act is more likely to be a one-off than an assault and battery with somebody who sleeps in the same room as you. The likelihood that it could repeat itself or rise to a more severe act such as strangulation or become a pattern of behavior, the likelihood is higher there. And so I think over time, the law started to recognize that this is a distinct type of behavior. And unfortunately, it's so pervasive that as social supports were put in place, it was deemed necessary to try to treat it differently, to try to both deter it and punish it.
Okay. So how many incidents make it a domestic violence?
Well, for the purposes of the law, at least in Massachusetts, you don't need more than one incident of physical violence against your intimate partner or the other parent of your children or a family member who lives in your household. If you act violently or threaten to act violently, right, against that person, the relationship itself will give it rise to a domestic violence claim as opposed to a regular assault and battery.
And what is the difference in treatment of?
Well, it can have different collateral consequences. Okay. So, for example, if you're accused of domestic violence and your results of the criminal case ends up being some sort of plea agreement, right? Mm-hmm. It is possible that that might preclude you from certain jobs, say in the healthcare field, right? Or even in a school setting, perhaps, right? Definitely for the case of immigration, both an assault and battery and a domestic violence assault and battery are considered crimes that are potentially either deportable acts or could delay your ability to change whatever your current immigration status is.
So there is a difference.
There is a difference.
Yeah.
Also, in a regular assault and battery, it's not likely that the result of a plea agreement will include things like a batterer's intervention course. Mm-hmm. We could have a whole discussion about whether or not there's a great value to courses like that. Yeah. But there are safeguards under the law that are meant to assist, as I said, to assist victims and to deter this behavior. Whether or not they're sufficient or efficient is sort of a more philosophical and policy question.
Now, statistically, generally, it says that it's around 85% of victims are women.
Right.
That does not speak to, as a caveat, doesn't speak to the to the sexual orientation of the abuser.
Right.
So we don't know, that could be a same-sex relationship, etc. But what about the men, right? I mean, the men can obviously there is the 15%.
Yes.
That.
So,
could be men.
There is, like it or not, there is a lot of evidence that the majority of victims of domestic violence are women. But, as you said, we only recently started keeping data about LGBT-identified persons and their relationships. And people like men and LGBT persons, in some sense, can be more reluctant to come out and say, hey, I'm being abused and I need help. It absolutely happens that men, both men on men and female on male violence occurs. But there's definitely more of a reluctance, I think, because partly we have a cultural bias where we assume a man can't be battered by a woman. And for the male on male relationship, they may just be reluctant to go to an authority anyway. They may be afraid that they'll be mistreated by the police, and historically, because certain populations have been either disenfranchised by the law or have had maybe negative experiences in their communities, like immigrant populations, et cetera, with authority figures, a lot of those folks will be more reluctant to even report. So data about certain groups is only now starting to sort of present itself where we realize, hey, this is a problem for everybody. I know I've represented males who were victims of domestic violence, and it was difficult for them not just to come forward, but it's awkward when you're in a courtroom, you're asking for a restraining order, you may look visibly more. So I guess it's not a question of strength. It takes me back to the definition.
The physical strength, you mean?
It takes me back to the definition of domestic violence, right? It's about power and control over the other person. And that doesn't necessarily mean a physical thing. It can be a physical thing. And in the cases where I worked, it got to court, so there was physicality against the male. I think we make the assumption that you should be able to defend yourself because you're a man, or this doesn't happen to guys, right?
Yeah, that's not so easy, because usually we're not supposed to hurt other people, not everybody. Generally, right? Generally.
Generally.
So the question we talked about the gender. In terms of the demographics, have you seen, it appears that the domestic violence exists in all demographics, whether it's a lower income, higher income, LGBT,
Absolutely.
or, migrant communities, minorities. Is that the correct statement?
That is absolutely
it's
correct.
Everywhere?
It's absolutely correct. I know people who are doctors who've been abused by their partner, and people who have not graduated from high school who've been abused from their partner, right? So socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, none of these things prevent you from becoming a victim of domestic violence, right? I think oftentimes we assume that people with a higher socioeconomic status and a higher education are going to be able to somehow avoid problems with legal issues or avoid these abusive relationships, but that's not necessarily the case. Again, it's about one person being able to psychologically manipulate or physically dominate the other person. And the pattern really addresses the fact that over time, the behavior sort of gets normalized within that relationship. So a lot of times people can be abused and not realize that they're in an abusive situation.
Because that's all they know.
Exactly.
That's all they know, that's their norm.
Exactly, and the economic abuse is actually a great example. Like people can be abused in that way and just not realize, this person is trying to delay my ability or somehow reduce my ability to leave.
So, so in those situations when there is psychological abuse or economical abuse, in most cases, the way you end up seeing it is because it does end up getting to that violence, right? The physical abuse.
The way we'll see it, the way it'll come across in an attorney or a court, right?
Because that's the only way.
But because of the law, again, we can't police all these behaviors, right? And so, if the way that your relationship works, whether you're married or not, is that one person controls all the money or one person does all the work outside the home, or one person has access to all of the sort of vital information, pension plans, health care, et cetera, and the other person doesn't have access, they may not even know, how much debt they're in as a family, what is really going on with the finances.
But sometimes it could be a cultural thing, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Not necessarily,
Yeah, and definitely not every case where a couple makes an agreement about how the work and the income in their family is going to be divided or handled is domestic abuse, right? And more often than not, it's either discovered that this has been going on because something rises to a physical level, or because someone says, I'm done and I'm leaving.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if we sort of look at those situations where, I guess I can think of it in sort of two options. Something happened and someone is afraid for their safety, so they want to get help. The only way, we just talked about it before the show, the only way really is for them is to contact the police, right? That is that step that they should take, or what should they do? If someone needs to get help, where do they go?
Well, so one of the first places you can go to is the National Center for Domestic Violence, right? Locally, there's several nonprofits that can assist people, all of which you can find through going to the National Center for Domestic Violence. You put in your zip code. It actually has a really nice list of some of the behaviors where you just kind of answer these questions to assess your own situation. So for those people who don't know if what they're going through is an abusive situation, it's a really helpful set of questions that can maybe provide some reassurance,
And
right?
maybe we can put the link to that website on at the end of our show.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
But the police, right, can help you with an emergency situation,
Okay.
right? Because again, the law can only really help you if there's been some sort of criminal act, right? If you believe that you're being psychologically or emotionally, economically abused, then your best bet would be to try to go through one of these nonprofits to try to get assistance.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely, you know, the police are going to have knowledge of where these locations are for your particular region or area. But, you know, kind of call 911 and saying, you know, I'm being psychologically abused.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, it's, you know, the police are really there for an emergency situation.
Absolutely.
Right.
So the follow-up question to that, it would be about sort of the third parties, right? The observers, the family members who are seeing that something may not be right.
Right.
They would like to help. They don't know how to approach the situation. You know, they don't know what to do, but they're afraid for the safety, or, you know, whether it's physical or psychologically of the loved ones.
And so there's not really a clear answer for that, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to see someone that you care about in an abusive situation. And so the most I think that someone could do is let the person who's being abused know that you see what's going on, that you are there to provide support in whatever way you can. You know, you can offer to find or help find resources. You know, a lot of the resources help folks formulate a plan for leaving in a safe way, which is really important. However, I would caution against sort of a confrontational approach, because as you mentioned, a lot of people don't know or don't believe that they're in an abusive situation. Once it becomes normalized, you know, it can feel like you're attacking my life, you're attacking my partner, my relationship. If that person isn't ready to recognize or hasn't recognized yet that they're in an unhealthy situation or an abusive situation, it might actually isolate them further. And that's sort of one of the key components that gives the person acting in an abusive way so much power and control, is that they're able to sort of become the only person in, you know, I'm the only person in your life who cares about you. That kind of, that thought becomes pervasive. And if your family, however well-meaning they are, if they get a little too aggressive with you before you're ready, it can just isolate that person more. They may be more reluctant to share what's going on. But, you know, that being said, we're all, you know, if we witness violence, we're all able to pick up the phone and say, this is what's going on, and seek assistance, you know. And whether or not it's a criminal matter that rises to a criminal matter, that can be determined after, right? I think if we witness something that's a genuine issue of safety, we all have the ability and maybe the moral obligation to call and try to stop it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. The psychological, economical, these are the hardest ones.
Yeah.
Because that's, you know, the family or friends are watching it, they're seeing it, and there's not much they can do.
Right.
What about the substance abuse, sort of the opioid crisis? Has that affected the number of domestic violent cases over the last few years?
So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a correlation at a minimum between these things. I don't have a specific number. I don't know if somebody's sort of tracking that. What I can tell you that we do know is that for teenagers, because teenagers in dating relationships sort of emulate the behaviors that they see either on television or in their own homes. So for teenagers who enter into relationships that are abusive, a lot of times it's the psychological and emotional abuse, not the physical. And so parents may not realize what's going on. Teachers may not realize what's going on. And those children are at a really higher risk of eating disorders, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation because of, here's this person that they care so much about who's treating them with such a degree of disrespect that it rises to abuse, and they definitely don't realize it. So that can be something maybe to look out for for parents.
That's very scary because you're talking about teenagers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a tough age is.
It's a tough age to communicate with.
And we just talked about how it is difficult to talk to an adult about these these things, not to mention a teenager. What about, with the few minutes we have left, what about the abusers? I mean, we talked about the victims, but who are the abusers usually? I mean, where is that coming from that,
So unfortunately, what we know is that children who witness or experience violence are more likely to act in violent ways. It doesn't mean that everybody who grows up and experiences violence or some sort of victimization is going to perpetuate that in the future. But statistics do demonstrate that children who are exposed or experience violent acts are more likely to commit them in the future. And what I can tell you from my work in the court system is that there are sort of these group sessions that are sometimes court-ordered for folks who are accused or convicted of committing domestic violence. But the court can't mandate you to go to one individual therapy and learn the root of your behavior and to correct that, right? So just recognizing that although there are legal safeguards and legal assistance, once again, the law can't police all behavior and the law can't correct all behavior. But there's not sort of a type, a specific socioeconomic status, ethnicity, age range, et cetera, for abuse, right?
So that would explain what they may have in common, right? Because that could exist across socioeconomic demographics. So that, that's pretty scary.
It can be, yes.
In closing, do you have any words to anyone out there who's watching, maybe concerned about someone or maybe thinking, what about me?
Again, I think there are a lot of good informational websites. There are a lot of local programs that can assist folks. Once you make the determination that this is what's happening, reach out for help, because there are, the worst thing is to think that nobody's going to help me and I truly am isolated. There are, legions of people who are ready to help. Change is hard, but if you're living in such an abusive situation, especially if you have children who are witnessing this, once you're ready, make that call, go on that website, get help, work through a safe plan, and get into a safe situation.
And there are people who do it for a living. They actually are experts.
They're wonderful expert people.
And so they know what they're doing, and they will do it
absolutely
the right way to keep them safe. But
yes.
And then thank you so much for coming on the show, for discussing this very important topic, and hopefully we'll have you on the show again. So
great, thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for watching.